Now we'll move on to our speaker. I think it's great that we've got such a good turnout here. Saw lots of conversation, discussion on the Facebook page, which I thought was really exciting, and I think we're going to be able to have a really good conversation. We have some books, which I think are mostly gone, but there's still a few there, and a poster with a quote from John Stuart Mill that I really like. And I won't read the whole thing to you, but the point is that Mill really emphasizes the point of not silencing expression, because it's important to hear from different people with different perspectives, even if, and he says, especially if those people are wrong. Because if they are wrong, then we can all talk about it and learn about why they're wrong and have a conversation that's not going to take place if we don't have that discussion. So that's why I think sorts of things on freedom of speech on campus, political correctness, are so important. There's an attitude, and I'm really actually torn about this, whether this is something I just see in the media or whether this is really happening. But there's at least a perception that students in some schools, in some cases, will not want to hear from people if they think they're wrong. And what I say to students, you should be listening to as many people who you think might be wrong as possible to figure out exactly what you think and to strengthen your arguments. So our speaker here today is going to be discussing some of those issues. Professor Saad teaches at Concordia University. He's professor of marketing. He's also studied at McGill, has a PhD from Cornell University, does a lot of work in sort of evolutionary psychology and marketing in the business world. But what he's going to be speaking to us today about is political correctness on campus and whether there's a stifling of ideas. And with that, I'd like you to welcome Professor Saad.
Hi guys, thank you for the lovely turnout. So what I'm going to do today is discuss instantiations of political correctness by actually referring to a lot of incredible cases that have happened, some in the United States and others in Canada, and then hopefully end with some recommendations. So fasten your seatbelts, trigger warnings, seek your safe spaces, get your blankets, here we go. So I'll talk about the language police a bit and university speech codes, which are antithetical to, certainly in the United States, with the ideas of the First Amendment. So by definition, they're wrong. The rejection of intellectual diversity, as Matt alluded to briefly. If you don't agree with my position, I shouldn't debate you. I should shut you down. Identity politics, another means by which political correctness is instituted. And then I'll talk about the culture of offense and perpetual victimhood via some of these recent phenomena of microaggressions, trigger warnings, safe spaces, cultural appropriation, and so on. All right. So let's start with these three famous gentlemen, but there are many others. We have Chris Rock on the left, Larry the Cable Guy in the middle, and of course Jerry Seinfeld on the right, all of whom have said that they refuse to play on campuses because the campuses are too politically correct. When I say I mean them, if I were to make a joke about racial differences or about homosexuals or about a particular group or about differences between men and women, then it might get very dangerous for me. But of course, much of comedy revolves around highlighting some of these stereotypes. Sometimes they're true, sometimes they're not, but that's where comedy lies. And if guys with this reputation are afraid to show up on campus, that sort of gives us a sense of the general atmosphere on campuses. Other comedians who've weighed in on this PC police include Bill Maher, John Cleese, Russell Peters, a Canadian, and Gilbert Gottfried, but there are many others. Okay, so that gives you a bit of a sense of how dangerous it might be to say the wrong thing on campus, at least from the perspective, in this case, of a comedian. So the current campus zeitgeist, the general atmosphere, let me give you a few examples. These are very, very recent ones. I chose these ones because they're so contemporary. They've happened in the last few days. The first one is truly breathtaking. It's difficult to imagine that someone is not making this stuff up. Martin Luther King is apparently a vile guy. Students, activists at the University of Oregon debated the removal of the historic quote, the I have a dream quote, because it was less than fully inclusive. So if Martin Luther King could be the target of attacks of non-inclusiveness, we're all in serious trouble. The University of California, Santa Barbara Multicultural Center is now offering a workshop instead of microaggressions, these are micro-affirming spaces that foster equity, inclusiveness, and people's strengths. So, of course, debating somebody and maybe proving them wrong would be an instance of microaggression, because God forbid that you would prove me wrong. The third one is also within the annals of that can't be possible. So a UBC law professor, Lorna June McHugh, didn't get tenure. I think she was there for 10 or 12 years at UBC, only published, I think, one thing, which wasn't a peer-reviewed publication. Peer review is the means by which academics judge one another's work. That's the means by which we debate ideas, and then hopefully if the paper gets published, it's because it's gone through a thorough review by your peer experts. So it's the means by which we conduct science and that we pursue academic pursuits. Well, this professor argued that the notion of peer review was contrary to her indigenous culture, which was based on oral traditions. So getting her to write things down and having it reviewed by peers was against her race, color, ancestry, place of origin, and sex. Now, you might think that the Human Rights Tribunal would laugh such a request, away. They didn't. It's now going to be heard. So somebody can genuinely, as an academic of 10 or 12 years, say the reason why I never published anything is because it's against my culture to publish anything. And someone takes that position seriously. Here's a paper written by a professor, I think, of English. The title of the paper is, I am a liberal professor and my liberal students terrify me. If you want the source, it's right there if you want to follow it up. I put up these quotes, and I'd like to read them because they actually say something very powerful about the environment in academia these days. I have intentionally adjusted my teaching materials as the political winds have shifted. I also make sure all my remotely offensive or challenging opinions, such as this article, are expressed either anonymously or pseudo-anonymously. Most of my colleagues who still have jobs have done the same. Hurting a student's feelings, even in the course of instruction, that is absolutely appropriate and respectful, can now get a teacher into serious trouble. In this type of environment, boat rocking, thinking outside the box, isn't just dangerous, it's suicidal. And so teachers limit their lessons to things they know won't upset anybody. This shift in student-teacher dynamics placed many of the traditional goals of higher education, such as having students challenge their beliefs, off limits. It's hurtful to challenge somebody in terms of their positions. So it's not just that students refuse to countenance uncomfortable ideas, they refuse to engage them, period. I don't want to hear opposing viewpoints. Foundation of Individual Rights and Education, the acronym is FIRE, directed by a good friend of mine, Greg Lukianoff, did an analysis of disinvitations. Disinvitations are instances where a university invites a speaker, say, for example, for a commencement address, and then typically students, sometimes faculty, sometimes staff, will set up some sort of effort to get that person disinvited for whatever reason. And so they've documented from 2000 to 2014, and this is an underestimate, of 192 such cases. This is in the United States. The success rate is roughly between about a bit more than a third to almost a half. So these are people that you've invited, and then somebody complains, and then you don't invite them anymore. Of course, the speakers that are most likely to be disinvited are the ones that are perceived to be to the right of those triggering the effort, right? So it's not as though you're equally likely to be disinvited, irrespective of the political position that you hold. Depending on your position, you're more or less likely to be disinvited. Now, of course, this is profoundly chilling because it basically says that universities are becoming echo chambers. Let's go on. This is from Canada, the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms. They come out every year with a scorecard of all Canadian universities in terms of how well they uphold and adhere to freedoms. And so they look at 4 specific metrics: the stated official university policies, the actual practices of the university, student union policies, and then student union practices. So each university, in this case in Canada, we've got 55 of them that were rated. So there are 55 universities times 4 scores. They could give you either an A, which is, it's a very free place, all the way to an F. So there are 220 scores. There were 8 A's given out of 220 scores in Canada. There were 41 F's. So there are roughly 5 times as many fully failing universities in terms of their ability to foster environments of freedom as there were on the other end of the continuum. For those of you that want to know how your school fares, University of Ottawa, with all due respect, scores an F, an F, an F, and a D. And just so that you don't think I'm bashing you guys, I put up my school as a counterpoint. We scored slightly better with a C, F, and a D, and an F. We both don't have much to be proud of. Examples of as I said, what I'll be doing throughout this talk is many of you don't know the type of landscape we're living in academia. And so by offering you some very vivid examples, hopefully it will contextualize for you how the winds are blowing. So examples of language police. These need not be strictly restricted, of course, to academia and academic settings, but you shouldn't say secretary, you should say administrative assistant, you shouldn't say janitor, it's a custodial engineer, and we could keep going down. You shouldn't say women, because women has men as part of it. It should be women with a M-Y-N. You shouldn't say a terrorist act. It's a man-made disaster. You shouldn't say a fat or obese person. It turns out that I am differently weighted. So when my physician looked at me and said, "Hey, God, you need to lose some weight," I said, oh, that's fattest. I'm differently weighted. You have no right to levy that accusation at me. Then you've got, instead of older students, students who are older because their age is older. That's ageist. They are non-traditional students. You don't say Merry Christmas in departments. You say Happy Holidays because it's offensive to trigger people with the word Christmas. How else do we institute a thought police in universities or political correctness? Well, we do so by having those who are entrusted with teaching the students, hopefully all holding roughly the same political viewpoints. So there's a study that was done by Cardiff and Kline, great study, I highly recommend you check it out, where they looked at the political registration, this is in the United States, of professors across 11 schools that varied very much. Some schools are private schools. We don't have this distinction in Canada, but in the US you've got public schools, you've got private schools, you have religious schools and secular schools, big schools, small schools. So they tried to cover the full spectrum, and they looked at the ratio of Democrats versus Republicans within the faculty. The ratio across all 11 schools was 5-to-1 Democrats. Now, that itself is quite problematic. Problematic not in the sense of you're taking a position, but Republicans are better. Problematic in that you're shutting out political diversity. There are some issues that are not black and white. There are some issues that can be tackled in a broad range of ways depending on your starting point from a political perspective. But before I get into that, as you may or may not know, the more you go into some of the social justice warrior type fields, the more that ratio gets more pronounced. So in engineering, you're likely to have a more even ratio across Democrats and Republicans, whereas in sociology, we have our sociologists over here, 44-to-1 ratio. That's not a typo. That's an actual number. There's a 44-to-1 ratio of Democrats to Republicans. if all of you are one day going to be parents of children who are studying in the United States, and if you are intellectually honest, you should be upset about that. It doesn't matter whether you believe in the positions held by the Democratic Party or those of the Republican Party. You want people to be exposed to diversity of opinions. My man. Thomas Sowell said, the next time some academics tell you how important diversity is, ask how many Republicans there are in their sociology department. In other words, we're very, very good at promoting endless forms of diversity. Racial diversity, ethnic diversity, religious diversity, sexual orientation diversity, and so on. But the most important diversity of all that should be at a university, which is intellectual diversity, no, that one we simply won't tolerate. We should all think in exactly the same way. And as I said, this is profoundly bad because not all issues have a veridical scientific answer. Some of the people wrote to me when I've talked about this and said, well, what do you mean? How could you not want people to be Democrats? Obviously, the Democrats are all smart, and the Republicans are all, toothless, redneck hicks. And so clearly it must be that you'd want your professors to be part of the Democratic Party. Well, of course, that's outlandish. There are things where that's true. For example, when it comes to evolution deniers, they're much more likely to be within the Republican Party. So think about a typical Southern politician who's part of the Republican Party. He or she is more likely to be an evolution denier. In that case, I'm against that position. But some things are not clear, black and white. What your position is on affirmative action or the death penalty or fiscal policy or gun control and so on might be different depending on your starting point. And you should be exposed to the different possible perspectives. Now this one is I'm giving you a sample here of a much longer document. This is a group of student activists at Dartmouth College. I was a visiting professor in 2002 at Dartmouth College. Great school, but certainly there are some rather aggressive student activists. So they had this thing called the Freedom Budget, where they occupied, I can't remember the exact details, maybe it was the president's office, and they demanded that each of these, demands be met. Now, I don't have all of them here, but I chose a few that are quite extraordinary. And again, bear with me as I read them. And again, think about how chilling it would be if such demands were met. So number one, you must establish Japanese language affinity housing, Korean language affinity housing, and Hindi, Urdu language affinity housing. Why stop at these three? There are 10,000 different cultures. Let's set up a Lebanese Armenian affinity housing. What about Lebanese Jewish affinity housing? What about Turkish Armenian affinity housing? What about Christian Palestinian affinity housing? Right? So that's what identity politics is, right? The individual is lost. My identity matters first as part of a group. The next one is quite a good one. Ensure that 47% of postdoctoral students are people of color. I don't know how they got 47, but apparently there's something quite magical about 47. And people of color, I'm from Lebanon. So am I okay? I'm not Caucasian. What I speak about when I talk about evolutionary psychology, will it be more veridical or less as a function of whether I were Caucasian or a person of color as I am, brown and fat? It's offensive. Create a Professor of Color series. Bring a professor of color once a month in order to expose the Dartmouth community to a wide range of ideas. So if you want to study number theory in the mathematics department, you want to study the distribution of primes, you should bring in a person of color to teach that because maybe he or she has a different perspective about the distribution of prime numbers? Or might that reality be invariant of the person's skin color? I don't think Martin Luther King would be very happy with this particular set of demands. Departments that do not have women or people of color will be considered in crisis and must take urgent and immediate action to right the injustice. Hey, math department, I don't see any women, people of color. It's crisis, time to intervene. Ask staff, faculty to use students' and employees' preferred gender pronouns. I gave a talk at Wellesley College a few years ago where a student came up to me after the lecture, and she thought that it was perfectly reasonable that at the start of each course, professors, suppose I have, like in this room, I don't know, 100, 120 people, before I start the course, I should individually poll each person to find out what their preferred gender identity is before we go on with the course. To which I asked her if she thought that that was truly an optimal way by which we should organize society. And she thought, yes, because in case there is somebody whom you might address incorrectly, you'd be sparing them their feelings by making sure you do this to everybody. All right. All male-female checkboxes should be replaced with write-in boxes to make forms, surveys, and applications more inclusive. Now, frankly, I don't know what some of these terms mean, but anyways, trans, asterisk, two-spirit, a gender non-conforming, and gender queer folks. This should be a campus-wide policy. So this whole idea that humans are a sexually dimorphic species, male, female, that whole biology stuff is a bunch of BS. We need to be putting all this trans star stuff. Enact curricular changes that require all students to interrogate issues of social justice, marginalization, and exploitation in depth. Each student should have to take classes that will challenge their understanding of institutionalized injustice around issues of race, class, gender, sexuality. This learning objective could be embedded in all first-year seminars. It doesn't matter what you're attending university for. You will have to go to this re-education camp. We will tell you what you have to think. I don't care that you're here to study engineering or biology or neuroscience. You must take this re-education camp to learn how to hold the proper positions. And of course, professors are not free of the Gulag number 13 education camp. All professors will be required to be trained in not only cultural competency, but also the importance of social justice in their day-to-day work. So between running studies, looking at how hormones affect, say, women's behaviors when they're shopping, I will have to take a break and attend a seminar to learn about social justice. Here are some other recent examples that are quite breathtaking. On cultural appropriation and safe spaces, the Yale, how many people are aware of the Yale Halloween incident? Okay, quite a few of you. For those of you who don't know about it, let me briefly summarize it for you. Nicholas Christakis is a very accomplished scientist. He's both a sociologist who studies sociometrics, how things move in groups, and he's also a physician. And Erica Christakis, I think she was a developmental psychologist. She had some sort of teaching position. And as is true of many universities in North America, the administration puts out a flyer asking people to not wear any costumes that might be cultural appropriation of somebody. So, don't wear a cowboy because that's whatever. Don't wear Native Indian. Don't wear an Arab suit. Don't wear Pocahontas. Pretty much there's no suit that you could wear. And so Erica Christakis wrote a unbelievably tame, gentle, carefully worded, tepid letter stating, maybe it's not right for universities to be imposing or interfering. These are adults. Yale students are adults, ultimately. They're at Yale. Maybe it's not really within the purview of the university to be doing this. Some social justice activists got very, very upset. And her husband, who's also the master of one of the colleges, came to her defense. Now, I'm going to show you trigger warning. There might be some words of profanity. So if you're going to be triggered, please cover your ears.
An exception is because other people have rights too, not just you.
Walk away. Walk away. He doesn't deserve to be listened to.
Unsafe space here for all. Stay quiet. For all standing students. You understand that?
As your position as master, it is your job to create a place of comfort and home for the students that live in Silliman. You have not done that. By sending out that email, that goes against your position as master. Do you understand that? Then
No, I don't agree with that.
Then why the fuck did you accept the position?
Because
Who
I have
the
a
fuck hired you?
I have a different
You
vision
should
than you.
step down. If that is what you think about being a master, you should step down. It is not about creating an intellectual space. It is not. Do you understand that? It's about creating a home here. You are not doing that.
You're supposed to be our
going against
advocate.
that. You hear that?
You get the general idea. So she's in his face, she's hostile, she's swearing at him. He's incredibly restrained and unbelievably polite. She argued that Yale is not about creating intellectual environments. It's about creating safe spaces. Okay? A home. Exactly. Here's another incredible example. Laura Kipnis. Does anybody know that case? Only a fewer. Okay. Laura Kipnis is a professor of, I think, film studies and media at Northwestern University. And again, notice that these are all very elite universities. It's not as though this type of atmosphere is something that is reserved for some outlier quack schools, right? These are, the hotbeds of intellectual thought, certainly in the United States, and of course, in many cases in Canada. So she wrote an article where she was rebutting this idea that, women are being raped all over campus. And she, by the way, she's an ardent feminist, right? She's a woman. She's an ardent feminist, so she holds all of the correct identity politic chips on her side. She wrote an article where she was trying to put in context that, maybe we need to sort of get a bit of a grip, that it's simply not true that there's this massive, gang rapes going on everywhere, right? Well, students filed a Title IX charge. Title IX is a federal statute or act that basically says that you cannot deny access to education for people based on their race and ethnicity and gender and so on. And the fact that she had written an article as an academic to rebut their position was threatening to them. So her expressing an alternate position was threatening. They would feel unsafe, and hence they wouldn't be able, and future students wouldn't be able to safely attend this university because of the position that she had taken. So to argue against somebody else's position becomes a form of assault that should be punished. Not good. And now we've got the beautiful microaggressions. This actually happened at one of my two alma maters at McGill. So Brian Fernan, VP of the Student Society of McGill University, sent out an email with the words, "Honestly, midterms, get out of here," followed by a doctor clip of President Obama. Has anybody seen this clip? Let me, I don't know if it will. Yes, you have? Okay. I'm not sure if it will. The edited video, so let's see that.
I appreciate the tenor of the conversations. I think it will actually yield results before the end of the year, and I look forward to continuing this dialogue in the months ahead. Thank you very much, everybody.
Okay. I mean, this literally was an attempt to say, right, get out of here, exams. I'm sick of exams. I'm tired of exams, right? Here's what ended up happening. The image in question was an extension. This is after he's bombarded by a witch hunt of social justice warriors. He's forced to issue an apology, which includes the following quotes. The image in question was an extension of the cultural, historical, and living legacy surrounding people of color, particularly young men being portrayed as violent in contemporary culture and media. By using this particular image of President Obama, I unwillingly perpetuated this living legacy and subsequently allowed a medium of the Student Association's communication to become the site of microaggression. For this, I am deeply sorry. Right? So this person who put together this clip as a means of sort of demonstrating his frustration at the workload that he had to apologize for this microaggression. Let's look at the next one. This is could be construed as part of the rubric of microaggressions, but I gave it a different title. It turns out, by the way, that being respectful and kind is a form of racism. So let's look at this one from Queen's University. So Aneesa Rouhani decided to wear a hijab for, I think it was 18 days, to see how people, she's an Iranian woman, but I think she's either Zoroastrian or maybe Christian. I can't remember exactly what she is, but she wasn't a Muslim woman. And she wanted to wear a hijab to see how people would respond to her when she wore a hijab. And it turns out that, to her surprise, she found that people were very kind and polite to her. Now, of course, what I would come with the conclusion, if I have a functioning brain, is that, well, maybe there aren't massive number of rabid KKK racists walking around everywhere. But she couldn't have that conclusion. It turns out that this overt tolerance and kindness is a manifestation of overcompensating for people's latent bigotry and intolerance. Being kind and tolerant is racist. In other words, by people being polite, kind, gracious with her when she was wearing a hijab, the only possibility is that they were compensating for the latent hatred that they had in their heart. Therefore, all roads lead to racism. If I am racist, I'm racist. If I am kind, gentle, tolerant, and non-racist, I'm racist. How could I not be a racist? I can't in the world of modern academia. Trigger warnings, yes. Trigger warnings on course syllabi. Oberlin College is really one of the places that's on hyper steroids of social justice warriors. They keep trying to outdo themselves. So they started with this whole, or at least they were one of the first to start with this idea that we should have a motion that requires professors to be aware of racism, classism, sexism, heterosexism, cis-sexism, ableism, and other issues of privilege and oppression. It also calls on professors to remove triggering material, anything that may cause a damaging emotional response when it doesn't directly contribute to learning goals, blah, blah, blah. So I thought, all right, let me look to see what types of topics might warrant a trigger warning. So here is a small list for you, and I will read them for effect. Discussion of sex, consensual sex. So I teach evolutionary psychology. Humans reproduce. They have this thing called sex. It's hard for me to teach the evolution of mating preferences and evolution of sexuality when the topic of sex is a triggering topic. You see the problem I'm in? You see the bind that I'm in? Pregnancy is triggering. Childbirth is triggering. Addiction, alcohol, needles, drug use, bullying, suicide. Death is triggering. Serious injury, sizeism, ableism, homophobia, blood, vomit, insects, snakes, spiders, slimy things, swearing, rape, abuse, child abuse, descriptions of medical procedures. That's going to be tough at a medical school. When I'm getting my residency in neurosurgery, it might be difficult to argue that those procedures are triggering. Corpses, skulls, skeletons, discussions of isms, dismissal of lived oppression, kidnapping, scarification, discussion of violence or war, Nazi paraphernalia, and anything. This we got to come up with sort of a brand topic if we haven't already covered everything else. Anything that might inspire intrusive thoughts for people who might be on the OCD spectrum, we need to have a trigger warning. So literally, anything that almost any professor could ever talk about may potentially require a trigger warning. Check out my trigger warning. Using your brain to navigate the real world should not entail a trigger warning. This course will assume that you possess the cognitive and emotional acuity of an adult. Life is your trigger warning. Sorry, I don't know why it came out 111. It should be 123. In case anybody is triggered by the number 1. One of the dangers of trigger warnings is that, not trigger warnings, of thought police and political correctness, is that people engage in self-censorship, right? You may not see this, right, because it's latent, right? So before you open your laptop and start writing that article that you want to publish on Huffington Post, you have to think, oh, should I do it, or will the social justice warriors come after me? My wife will often come nervously behind me when I'm working on my laptop, and she looks nervous. She says, oh, what are you writing? And I said, well, I'm writing something. What is it? And she'll say, remember, we have 2 children. Now, the fact that a mother could look to her husband in the 21st century in Canada, he's a professor, and she's arguing, please be careful with the words you use because we have young children. She's not saying this because she's some, paranoid lady who's unaware of the realities of life. That's, right? That's the proverbial robin singing in the coal mine. Where is it? Not robin. Canary singing in the coal mine, right? I mean, that's saying something quite profound about the type of environment that we live in, where you have somebody who is afraid for the safety of their children. This is precisely how totalitarian anti-liberal ideologies flourish. Number one, if they can, in certain places in the world, they simply literally behead you. Say the wrong thing and you're dead. Now, in the West, you can't do that yet. But what you can do, you could behead them in other ways. You could behead them by stifling them through various non-violent means. You could harm somebody's reputation. So Richard Dawkins, many of you know him, right? You can't behead him in the West, but you certainly can try to tar him. You could try to make him out to be a neo-Nazi, hateful, racist bigot. He's none of those things. He's about as liberal as you can get. You could go for Sam Harris and say that he is a Dr. Mengele, Hitler-type guy. He's none of those things, right? And of course, you could create a climate of fear where you just censor yourself. And then that's it. We don't have to worry about you saying anything that is against our ideology. Healthy societies, I don't mean to moralize, but it's very important, especially in the context of the Institute for Liberal Studies, to remind people of these. Healthy societies are precisely those that are unapologetically free. That's how you establish that a society is healthy. When you go to see your physician, there are a few very quick metrics that he or she can take to determine your sort of basal level of your health, right? Let's check your weight. Let's check your blood pressure. Let's do a quick blood work to see your cholesterol score. Let's check your blood sugar. And hopefully we have a good baseline to know if you're heading down the right path. Well, if you want to do a similar, quote, medical test on societies, look to see how free they are. How much economic, political, religious, sexual, reproductive freedom, and so on they have. All of those freedoms, none of them can happen, none of them can be protected without freedom of speech. That's the one from which everything else flows. What political correctness does is it attacks that fundamental freedom. It is an affront to freedom of speech to be constantly shackled by the fears imposed upon us by the politically correct thought police. And so, what is my, again, I don't know why it's 1-2-1, it should be 1-2-3. So, we need to eliminate all forms of thought policing. And I'm already seeing a greater number of people that are gaining courage to speak out against some of these movements. One of the things that I say with regret is true about me is that I'm one of the few academics that is so openly, exhibiting disdain for all of this. It shouldn't be so surprising that an academic gets up and says, hey, it's enough, right? Yet most people are afraid of their shadows. Most people are careerists. They're afraid that if they utter the wrong word, how will this affect my career? So they stay quiet. What we need to do is freedom of thought and freedom of speech, as I said, are the two most fundamental human rights. They are the bedrock on which Western liberties and freedoms have been enshrined. No more campus speech codes. Campus speech codes are an affront to our most fundamental liberties. Now, you shouldn't, of course, scream fire in a theater. That's the classic test. You shouldn't say things that incite violence against other people. You shouldn't say things that defame or that are libelous against other people. That's it. Everything else is open. Nothing is out of bounds. Either you're free or you're not. We should promote vigorous intellectual debates. We should seek intellectual diversity. All ideas, beliefs, and ideologies are open to criticism, debate, mocking, ridicule, and other forms of scrutiny. Nothing, no one, no ideology gets a free pass. And finally, we should eradicate the ethos of coddling and infantilizing university students. No safe spaces, no trigger warnings, no microaggressions, no cultural appropriation, no special privileges based on identity politics. Liberal societies believe in the sanctity of the individual and not in the non-equal treatment of groups rooted in oppression Olympics and victimology poker. Thank you very much. And now I will take questions or comments. Yes, sir. I can answer that without specifically referring to Marxism, right? I think it's by getting people to have this sufficient courage to stand up. So one of the reasons why, and some of you follow me on my various social portals and so on, and I hope you'll attest to the fact that I take quite a bit of my time to engage with people. Not because I'm not very busy in a typical day, but it's because people seek me to say, hey, I'd like to contribute to the debate. I don't know how to do it, right? So if each of us takes a bit of their busy day to try to create an environment to bring out everybody, things can quickly flip. In other words, it doesn't take much for the pendulum to swing. But what you need to have to happen is that, you know what, does anybody know what the tragedy of the commons is? Does anybody? Okay. Let me, you do know what that is? Okay, so I'm going to explain it for many of the people who don't. So tragedy of the commons, and I'll link it to how I'm answering you. Suppose you've got 10 farmers who have their livestock grazing on the land. And the land is getting trashed because of the excessive grazing. And so the 10 farmers decide for the next 2 years, we're all going to stop our livestock from grazing on this land. Let's shake an honors agreement. And then hopefully in 2 years from now, the land will have recovered. The tragedy of the commons happens because what do you think happens? Each of the individual farmers says, you know what's the optimal outcome? For me to cheat on the agreement, have my livestock still graze on the land. The other 9 guys will be super honorable and won't do it. And that's the best case scenario. The land will still recover and I still get to graze my land. Yes? Have my animals graze the patch. But of course, the tragedy of the commons is that they all think that, and then we get into a problem. Now, how do I link that to your story? Tragedy of the commons happens where each of us says, you know what? Somebody else, let Saad fight this fight. I'm too busy today going to the party tonight. I'm buying my tomatoes and groceries. Let Sam Harris worry about it. No, each of us has the responsibility to contribute to this debate. And if enough of us stand up and say, look, we want to live in a free society where everybody is allowed to speak openly, things will change. Yes, sir. Right. So, yeah. So, I mean, what you're doing there is arguing against or for affirmative action. When I put up this example, so I guess you're arguing about this one, right? My point is not, you should not construe from me putting this up that I'm either for or against affirmative action. My sole point in talking about this is that what you shouldn't have is the type of environment on campus where only those who are for affirmative action are allowed to have a voice in the, quote, non-existent debate, right? All I'm saying is, I don't care what your position is. You're for affirmative action, let's hear it. He's against it. And he should be given the right to speak about it. What happens on campuses is, if you are for abortion, you're welcome and you're progressive. If you're against abortion, you're not. Okay. Now, I happen to be I'm pro-abortion. But I fully support the right for religious folks who might have their own moral compass to argue why they're against it, to exist, to have a right to speak. That's not what happens on campuses. What happens on campuses is I'm only willing to engage those with whom, that share my ideas. That's not good. Yes, sir. It probably will be addressed in the forthcoming book that I'm starting to work on. It's a long answer. I think it's a confluence of many, many different factors. So, for example, there's a culture of entitlement, the culture of narcissism, the culture of perpetual victimhood. There are all sorts of singularly unique factors that contributed to creating this tsunami of BS. Yes. Yes. Yeah, great question. So I often get professors writing to me privately to share with me their admiration of what I do. Yet that same professor will not press the like button on a Facebook clip. So imagine how intimidated that individual is. I mean, and believe me, I mean, go to my stuff. It's not as though I put up outrageously, crazy stuff, right? I mean, I'm very, one of the reasons I think I've been fortunate not to have, hatemongers coming after me and so on, is that, I mean, I'm quite measured in what I talk about. I mean, I talk about from a position of, I think, facts, and then, so usually the hate guys don't come after me. But yet they're still afraid to like my Facebook page, because they've really been taught at this point that just holding a position is dangerous. Just always sit on the fence. Always be quiet. Never talk about religion. Never attack. And for example, postmodernism. I'll give you an example, right? So postmodernism is a movement that basically says, for those of you who are not familiar, everything is relative. There are no absolute truths and so on. That's why it is known as an anti-science movement, because science operates on the premise that there is a truth out there to be discovered, and hopefully we're going to try to approximate it. And so I go after postmodernists. Most of my colleagues who write to me and say, oh man, you're exactly intimating what I want to say. So why don't you say it? Well, because my colleague is a postmodernist. I'm afraid because I'm going to be up for promotion next week, right? So for all sorts of very human, earthly reasons, people basically cower. And to answer your question and then yours, the only way we're going to break out of this is by having a sufficient number of people have the conviction to stand up and say, no, this is wrong, I won't have it. And then things will change. Yes, sir. Yeah. It's a mass delusional phenomenon. It's basically they're involved in an orgiastic, in vivo cannibalistic thing on themselves. So now the snake is eating its own tail. It's just it's an outlandish phenomenon. I mean, historians in the future will look back at this period with great amazement because it's simply extraordinary. I mean, I had a colleague who, here's another story about political correctness. I had a colleague who tweeted, a very, very accomplished evolutionary psychologist, the most meek, gentle, liberal guy you could imagine. I know him personally. He's a friend of mine. He put up a tweet where he said, now, you might say that the tweet was obnoxious, and I would agree. He said something to the effect of, hey, overweight folks or students, if you don't have the willpower to avoid that pasta dish, how likely are you to finish your dissertations? Obnoxious. It was obnoxious. I wouldn't put up that. Not because I'm politically correct, because I don't think you should frivolously be, right? He thought he was doing a funny quip. It backfired. Now, if you saw the backlash that this guy got, he was let go from his visiting professorship at Stern Business School in New York University. They tried to see if they could fire him from his tenured position at University of New Mexico. And when they weren't able to do that, they were actually very upset. So imagine the mindset of somebody who can spend all their effort to try to rally up a mob, an e-mob, to try to get rid of it. Now this guy should not have probably written that tweet. I mean, it was obnoxious. There was no reason for it, right? But should it be that he should lose his entire career? Well, if you come from an ethos of never offend anybody, then yes, he should be feathered, tarred, and lynched. That's grotesque. I mean, I do have success. I get tons of emails and communiques from people saying, look, I started at position X, but after following you, I'm now in it. But it's costly. It's effortful. You know, it's not easy because you have people who've been inculcated with these ideas for, 10, 15, 20 years. It becomes very difficult to extricate their heads from the sand. One of the expressions that some of you who follow me will have heard me use is the Ostrich brigade, right? So the Ostrich brigade are the folks, it's not quite the same thing as the regressive left. I mean, usually members who are in the regressive left also are proud ostriches. But the Ostrich brigade are basically folks that have their head in the sand and they're really impervious to reason. But we have to be optimistic and hope that we could reach them. So hang in there. You'll make a difference. Yes? Well, you should be allowed to be an idiot. So in other words, if you were the head of the National Institutes of Health and you said, hey, I believe that vaccinations cause autism, and that is clearly not what the scientific evidence suggests, then you could say, hey, based on your professional position, you're not allowed to hold that position. But an individual can walk around and be perfectly wrong. Right? We can't shut them down. Let me give you a perhaps more grotesque example. When I was a doctoral student at Cornell, there was a guy, I can't remember his name, who was doing the rounds of all the elite schools, basically under the guise of, hey, I'm here to discuss, to debate whether the Holocaust happened or not. Well, I mean, if there's ever been a historical fact that is clear, is that the Holocaust happened. It's quite offensive, if you'd like, to have to debate it. Why don't we debate whether Ottawa exists? Why don't we debate whether there is a room here, right? So, but yet, despite the fact that I find this grotesque, he's allowed to be this offensive. He's allowed to be this wrong. In the competition of ideas, just by having everything out in the open, eventually the mechanism is autocorrective, and the idiotic ideas will lose. And that's why we have the peer review process, right? So that lady who's an indigenous person who said, I shouldn't be under the purview of peer review. So how do we judge your work, right? So that's how we do it. We keep things in the open. You have a right to speak. I have a right to speak. If you win, hey, good for you. To keep it within the theme of what we're talking about here is foster the environment that allows for people to never engage in self-restraint when engaging in political dialogue, right? Let me give you an example. A few days ago, I had as a guest on I have a YouTube channel where I invite guests to chat with me. I had a guest by the name of Professor Salim Mansour. He's a political scientist at Western University. He's a practicing Muslim, very, very serious about his religion, very liberal and secular guy who appeared in front of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Immigration and Citizenship to basically argue against an open door policy from people coming from his background, right? Well, he may be perfectly wrong, or he may be perfectly right, or he may be somewhere in between. But if we live in a free society, that guy has a right to go and do this. So we have to create the environment in these rooms, in Parliament, in our bars, everywhere where people feel free to share ideas. Sometimes those ideas are grotesque, then they will lose out in the battle of ideas. Yes, sir. So the only thing that I know of the case is that he won, but I heard, but I haven't read the decision, that some of the things that the judge said seemed a bit chilling. So I don't know enough about it, so you probably know more about it. But at the very least, I'm happy that he won. For those of you who don't know, this is a guy who I guess tweeted, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, who tweeted against some sort of staunch feminists some stuff, and so they accused him of cyberbullying, correct? And he can't be next to a computer for 2 years or something like that, right? Yeah, he was banned from the internet for about a year, right. Over $100,000 in legal. Right. Incidentally, just for you to know, I had a similar situation. I engaged with three separate women. One of them had set up a site called Rape by Fraud. And she was trying to pass a bill or a law in the United States whereby if a person in a duplicitous manner gets somebody else to go to bed with them. For example, you lie about your income. You lie about your age, right? You engage in duplicity to bed someone. That should be rape by fraud. So I put up a sad truth. My YouTube channel, by the way, is called The Sad Truth, SAAD, where I basically said, 95% of people who engage in online dating should be summarily taken to prison because they're all rapists. Instead of engaging me, she started sending me threatening things, saying, I'm going to get my lawyer to sue you for defamation. So in her worldview, she takes a public position, another public figure attacks her position, that's defamatory to her. That is chilling. And then I had 2 Forbes journalists, female journalists. I went back and forth with them on Twitter, and the minute that they saw that I was kind of a no-nonsense guy, they started crying cyberbullying. So I pulled the big card out of my pocket. I said, why are you attacking a brown, overweight man from Lebanon? Guess what happened? Poof, they disappeared. Because when it came to victimology poker, I hold the cards. Now that's grotesque, right? She's not engaging me based on the merit of my arguments or hers. It's who holds the better victim cards. I win, she goes away. Had I been a white guy from California, I'm dead. So I have a theory for that. You ready? All right, get ready. Trigger warning, trigger warning. There is a disorder known as Munchausen syndrome. Okay? Munchausen syndrome is a psychiatric disorder where typically a biological mother, well, this is Munchausen syndrome by proxy. Let me step back. Munchausen syndrome is where I fake illness and I go to the hospital because that will garner me a lot of sympathy, right? Munchausen syndrome by proxy is where I harm my child or my pet or my elderly parent so that way I could take them to the hospital and people say, oh my God, what's wrong with little Johnny, right? Well, I think this hyper sort of victimology poker is a manifestation of this type of Munchausen syndrome. I can garner a lot of sympathy by constantly walking around through life through a prism of endless victimhood. People respond to that. Oh, it's okay, you're a protected class. Oh, it's okay, gentle, right? Listen, it's hard to argue this stuff with me because I always can cash the card of I escaped execution in Lebanon. Therefore, you better have a really strong victimology story to outdo mine. And usually, again, they run away. So this is what happens when people are using their identity for these types of purposes. It's grotesque. Be proud of who you are. Nobody should harm you for who you are, but you don't have to constantly put it in my face.
We'll make this the last question because there's a class coming up.
Is there anybody who hasn't spoken? I'll let him decide. I don't.
You're like streaming, so please go ahead.
Sorry about that.
We'll wrap up then, so the other class come in. Just 3 quick comments before we leave. One is we've left some feedback forms. If you have any comments or questions, please leave those on the desk. We'll pick them up. Second is I want to thank all of you for a very respectful and interesting discussion, and also thanks to our speaker.
Thank you.